Good morning, everybody. We are live. Congratulations, you made it through the week. Another one in the bag. Successful food safety, food quality, making sure people are happy and well fed and safe. Good job. If nobody else is going to tell you, Alan and I are here to tell you good job. My name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And if you're here and you're new to the show, welcome. Pull up a chair. This is the Food Safety Chat Live. And every week I bring an expert on the show and we live stream on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And we talk about all things food safety. And one of the things that you'll notice with this is that this is not a presentation. This is not us lecturing to you on a particular topic and imparting our wisdom to you. No, this is a conversation. This is an interactive chat where we give some of the information that we have and we have a reciprocation. And one of the things that you'll find if you're new to this community is that the chat is amazing because we have all kinds of interaction and people answering each other's questions because, as we all know, food safety is not a point of competition. It's something where we collaborate and we all work together to make the food supply better. And so if you're new to the chat, one of the things that we love to do here, I'm always amazed by this, Alan, is let us know where in the world you're at. I'm in Loveland, Colorado. Stephanie's in here first. Of course, she's in beautiful Germany. So Stephanie, great to see you. And Allen Sayler with CFSRS. And I always forget this, right? It's the Center for Food Safety and Regulatory Solutions, correct?
That's absolutely right.
Yes, I got it. And where are you at, Alan?
I'm just south of Washington, D.C., about 30 miles in lovely suburbia.
It's how's your weather been?
It's actually been a relatively cool late spring, early summer, whatever you want to call it. Other than some of the Canadian wildfire smoke that came down last week when I was not here, but really affected the air quality to the point where the advice was to stay indoors for 2 days and not go anywhere. It's been wonderful here. A little dry.
Nice. So some of the smoke got down your way, but not as much as we saw in New York City, or?
Not quite as much, but it was still the air quality. I've never seen an air quality index of purple before, but we had purple.
Yikes. So I'm not here in, as we typed in here, Loveland, Colorado, where it's been atypical to say the least. I think within a few days here in early June, we'd already reached our precipitation total for the entire month. And last night we had a big rainstorm, more on the way. Colorado's been under drought warnings for years now. And that's pretty much been all erased. I was watching the news this morning and said like 1% of the state now is under a drought alert. So that's all good news. Look at all these wonderful people filing in here. So Renee, Laurel, Jessica, good morning. Cara, of course. Allie's out in San Diego. Claire. Buenos Dias from Miami, Florida. It almost sounds like our friend Jose Sabal. I wonder if he's here incognito. That could very well be. But Megan, good morning. Nice to see you as well. So if you are dialed in any way in the food industry, and especially on the dairy side of things, Allen Sayler is a name you're very familiar with. And so it's always a pleasure to have Allen on. And one of the things that we do and we prep for this is we will prepare some notes and ideas and topics and discussion points to make sure we're getting you the best value and content that we can in these discussions. And we were getting ready here to come on, and I'd mentioned to Alan, I think today is the record, Alan. Five pages of information ready to be bestowed upon and shared with our audience today. So that's pretty amazing. Steve Hammond. Long time no see, Alan.
Well, good things we're not going to be reading it.
Exactly. So one of the things that we always do in the chat here, everybody, if you're new to this as well, is we like to have a ceremonial sip of your favorite beverage. And in honor of today's call today, I've got my periodic table mug. So cheers, everyone. Very good. Very nice. So, boy, let's dive in. We have a lot to go over today. So one of the things, Alan, when you're putting together a food safety plan, well, I guess, first of all, an observation around this is one of the things, and we just talked about this before we came on the air here too, is if you try to be an expert in everything, you're going to be an expert in nothing. And you have to have areas of expertise. So when you look at this in relation to a food safety plan, most people gravitate toward the microbiological side of things, right? It's pretty clear cut. It's okay, here's listeria, go get that listeria. And these type of activities. Foreign material, same thing, right? Okay, we're going to put in screens, we're going to do inspections, we're going to make sure that the PM programs are working well. But that third bucket, Alan, chemicals, oh my goodness, that's a real challenge for people to get a handle on how you do and how you look at risk for the chemical side of things.
But I agree with you. And, if you were talking about microbiological, if you want to add spoilage organisms, indicator organisms, pathogens, you'd have lists that are, 20, 30 long probably, and certainly exceed the time that we've got. Well, guess what? When we move into the chemical arena, we have similar challenges. And it's not that every chemical needs to be considered a hazard, but frankly, in prepping, and thank you for asking me to join, I was actually very surprised at the emerging chemicals of concern that may or may not need to be considered in looking at hazards, depending on your food, depending on your ingredients, depending on whether you use water as an ingredient or as a cleaning, which most of us do. So, yeah, I think we've got a lot here to discuss, and I look forward to having people that are joining us either ask questions or bring in their experiences.
Yeah, and I think too a key lesson around this as well is dosage, right? And this is where I think things get confusing as well, is because as we were mentioning with listeria, it's like, no, it's zero, absent. You don't find it. But even with microbiological testing, you have a resolution level, right? So if you're doing a 10 to the minus 1 test, you can say it's less than 10 per gram. You can't say there's nothing there. And with chemicals, especially, Alan, it seems like more and more, and as part of this research that you did, and thank you for going through all this work, and I will post this information in our locals group, is we used to talk about parts per million. It's like, okay, well, we need to analyze these things, and then it went to parts per billion, which is 1,000 times more accurate. And then the information we have today, I was really surprised to see some of the information here from EPA. They're starting to look at parts per trillion. That just blows my mind. How can you even detect levels like that?
Yeah, and how can you be certain that it's accurate? I mean, we just had something microbiologically where a state lab made a mistake microbiologically, and they said, well, I know that you recall the product, but hey, it's our bad, don't worry about it. Well, that is not unique for chemicals, and it's not the problem of chemistry of the labs. That's not the point. The point is these minute levels and the interferences and the capabilities of the lab and the methodology. As we go to almost trying to chase zero, which is foolish, but we do see customers sometimes expecting that. Sometimes governments are expecting that. It's not realistic. There is no zero in these emerging chemicals. And so what is the appropriate ADI? How did you calculate that? And from the ADI, you get a maximum level. And what is that? Well, I know in my work in food additives at the Codex level, there's an organization called JECFA. It's highly respected, and it has toxicologists that actually look at ADIs for all kinds of things. And then from the ADIs, then the committees establish what they think are appropriate maximum levels. And the views are quite different sometimes. The US is viewed a little as being maybe a little too flexible and except in maximum levels. And the EU is sometimes viewed as a little too strict. So if you're exporting product to the EU, but you're based in the US, you've got some interesting challenges as far as chemical hazards.
Oh, absolutely. And the big one for Europe that comes to mind immediately, Alan, is ethylene oxide. So a major fumigant that's used in industries worldwide where the EU has said we're no longer allowing this. And people are scrambling to try and figure out what other potential avenues do they have for the treatment of their products. So flours and things like this, of which there's really only two other options, right? There's steam treatment or irradiation. And the second one, people, that really scares them. And the first one, if you've got a flour product or something like this, you can't expose it to steam. You're going to end up with a giant brick. And I've seen recently recalls in Europe where product is being brought in from other countries that don't have these rules, and they've been having recalls associated with this as well.
Yeah, and add Australia to the list with the EU. Australia's banned the use of ethylene oxide since 2002, 2003. So that's one example. And so the good thing is, though, that we've got this amazing system in most food plants that can take out all these chemical contaminants. Oh,
Mhm.
that's right. That's not true. Carbon filtration maybe works in some cases, doesn't work in many cases. We don't have this, pasteurization or sterilization or this aseptic processing systems that can take care of the microbiology of a hazard. We don't have that for chemicals. And so what do? I mean, you look at some of the recalls recently, and the most recent regarding chemical hazards are actually allowed food additives or hormones in dietary supplements.
Oh.
I should say they're allowed under certain medical conditions. They're not allowed in a food. And yet we find quite commonly the dietary supplement industry is liking to be innovative, and they put these things in. And these things are viewed as chemical contaminants. And I'm sure it's not just the dietary supplement industry. We're all looking to be innovative, and new foods is the thing. Today we have foods on the market that are better living by chemistry. And do we understand all of the chemical interactions? We've got things that mimic burgers, seafood, pork, chicken that have none of those ingredients in them. And so, what's the chemistry? What do we understand it? In some cases, I think the answer is we have no clue.
Exactly. And yeah, coming back to production facilities. So ADI you'd mentioned earlier. So what average daily intake, right, for people, and just like everything else within your food safety plan, you're looking at your target audiences. So if you're selling product to children, oh my goodness, right, very different levels and allowable units associated with that. And even just sitting here thinking about a production facility, how about coatings on equipment? Right. So you have Teflon coatings or things like this within the equipment that people are now going back and looking at and saying, this is really nice from a cleaning standpoint, but there's a lot of scraping that takes place in this tank as this agitator moves around in here. Where's that stuff going? Right. And we don't know. We don't necessarily know. Of course, as we kind of go through our list and think about it here, Alan, the biggie that everybody always addresses, and this is kind of the easy infield single, is allergens, right? Allergens are a chemical risk within products, and that's how they're considered.
Yeah, no, I agree. And of course, in the U.S., sesame seed is the newest member of the family, so to speak. I think that in sesame seed products, so sesame seed itself is relatively easy to control. You have it, you don't. It's not like
Mhm.
peanuts. It's not like tree nuts. And so, but what about the sesame seed oil? What about the sesame seed byproducts? Remember, we had this thing, soy lecithin, and it was not an allergen. And then all of a sudden, FDA decided it was an allergen after looking at the industry and reviewing the fact that it wasn't necessarily as highly refined as the industry was maybe representing it. So, yeah, I would be very cautious. And again, is that list of 8, or you can say 9 now in the U.S. Sacrosanct? You go to Canada, it's 11. You go to Europe, it's, I don't know the number, but I'm thinking around 18.
Uh-huh.
So, and those are chemical hazards.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, part of how the industry is reacting, and people are kind of ticked off about this, and we'll see how it goes, is if you're a bakery and you're making hamburger buns for a retailer or something like this, if you have one formula that's got the little sesame seeds on the top of the bun, those little dudes get everywhere. And good luck trying to keep those off of non-sesame products. So I have seen out there, Alan, that a lot of bakeries and companies that do this is like, okay, fine, we're going to add sesame to everything and just declare it on everything. And now if you're allergic, your food options have just been drastically cut.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge, and the good thing, if there is a good thing about allergens and sesame and all the others, is we have some history. We could call them emerging because sesame, for instance, is new in the United States, but we have a little bit of experience about what to do, what not to do, the mitigation strategies. Unfortunately, that isn't the case for some of these others. And Brian, I'm just going to throw these out name wise. I'll let you discuss, or if others have interest. But I think, we have the chlorates, which are a big deal in Europe right now, the
Oh yeah.
perchlorates, which are a big deal in Europe and the US. I think with the Biden administration, very likely we're going to see some type of an EPA mandated level of perchlorates, at least in drinking water. You mentioned ethylene oxide, but PFAS, I know in the dairy industry right now, FDA inspectors, when they arrive at dairy plants, their almost first question is not about, hazards. What are you doing for food security? Those big things that we expect. They're talking about do you know about PFAS? And PFAS is really the poster child right now of emerging chemical contaminants in the US. And it
Mhm.
went from 0 to 100 probably in 6 months. We also have other things like personal care products, let's just use the term cosmetics. We've got hormones, we've got phthalate esters, we've got the old and maybe not so old pesticides and herbicides. And we've got something new, engineered nanomaterials. Now, our
Oh
list
yeah.
here and our reference is higher, but I think I'll stop there because it all of a sudden gets a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, let's swing back and kind of work through these because it seems like these things kind of pop up, don't they? So you're running food safety quality assurance in the company, and all of a sudden you just get absolutely buried by requests from retailers saying, "We want a letter from you certifying that all of your products are free of PFAS." And you're like, okay. And of course, they want this letter immediately. And you're like, oh, I don't know anything about this. I need to find out more about this. First off, is what does it even mean, right? So it's per and polyfluoroalkylated substances, right? Say that correctly 2 times in a row. Good luck. And these things are human-made chemicals, and they're in all kinds of products, right? So from your research here, Alan, foams, firefighting foams, frying pans, stain-resistant clothing, dental floss, food wrappers, and more. So then you've got to reach out through your supply chain and say, okay, I've got primary packaging. Now I need to talk with those people and find out if they are concerned about this and if they're using those things in my products. And does this mitigate? Not mitigate. I'm sorry, migrate. Is this migrating into my products? And when you're talking about, as we open this conversation, detection limits in the parts per billion, what if it's there and you put out a letter that says, I certify that these products are free from this. What does free mean, right? Zero. And that's a difficult thing.
And the good thing is that the trade associations, some of the nonprofits have decided to go out and do massive sampling of foods and food packaging. Oh, wait a minute. That's right. They have not done that. So where do you get this information? I mean, it's costly. And I'll tell you the view that I've heard from a couple of the nonprofit trade associations in the food industry is we're not going to do that because it's so you find it, and this is the latest poster child, right? So we find anything. It could be in the parts per trillion. How does that play out to the consumers and to the press? Oh, you've got it. You've got it in this food or that food, or it's common bakery or something like that. And there is a no-win situation here. So it is not that we don't want to know this. There is no way to manage this right now because it's like Alar and apples, which shows, my hair tells you how long I've been around. Alar and apples just about destroyed the American dairy industry. And then we
Yeah.
found out that it was not a big deal. Its toxicity was very low, but by that time, everybody had to demonstrate that there was no detectable levels of Alar in apples. Well, PFAS is the modern example of that. So if you get these demands, like you said, from your customers saying, I want to know right now, I'd love to hear other people's ideas because I don't know what you do. Do you test? Because if you test, you're likely to find something, even if it's very low.
And then to your point earlier, what about the reliability at the laboratory? Because if you're testing at these small levels of detection and you're a bench chemist working and doing these type of tests, man, super, super easy. If you don't clean your glassware correctly and remove all contaminants and something gets a hit, now you're kind of stuck. Now what do you do? And Duncan's got some great comments here, and so glad to have you back, Duncan. And risk a lot of times is figured out retrospectively. We don't know. Asbestos, right? That comes to mind, right? Fantastic insulator. It's cheap. It's in the environment. We just got to put it together and put it well. And we found out what's going on with that and how that damages people's lungs. And yeah, so the retailer comment relative to the letters that I just made, he's got a good point here too, is that, yeah, okay, fine, I've got to do one letter, but as you go back in the supply chain, those poor guys have, hundreds of requests for these type of things. And part of it too is, and we see this more and more now with the world that we live in, with trying to get attention, right? We see it on Twitter or whatever. You see a headline on a video that says, so-and-so destroys so-and-so. And you're like, ooh, I'm going to click on that, right? I want to see that. And you watch it, and 9 times out of 10, no, they didn't get destroyed. They're just trying to get you to click on it. And it's the same with chemicals and things like this. I remember, 5 years ago or so, is there rocket fuel in your water? Check it, tune into the news at 10 o'clock tonight, and we'll tell you if your family's at risk from perchlorates, right? And then that just starts the avalanche. And it goes that way, and you get all these letters again, right? Certify that your product doesn't have rocket fuel in it. You're like, what? Okay, right? And then all of a sudden the laboratories have all this work that they need to do, figuring out methodologies and testing and detection limits and all of these type of activities. And then I don't know, Alan, but from my viewpoint, I haven't heard anything about that in a long time. Have you?
No, but it actually is it's again, it is the poster child for this month or the 6-month period, and it's not gone away. I mean, this paper that it's not done in any peer-reviewed manner. It's just a collection so that if somebody throws up, PFAS or PHAs or PPCPs, what does that mean? Well, if you're in the quality world, you're supposed to know this stuff, right? Except we can't know everything about everything, and I certainly don't. But I would encourage everybody, when this is over, Bryan will post this paper. Please understand, it's not peer-reviewed. It's just a collection of information. It's a quick reference guide. So yeah, jet fuel. Well, that was a hot story a few years ago, and now what is it? PFAS. Now what about PP? The personal care products. That seems to be getting more attention. Hormones, which we've heard of for a long time, primarily the estrogen in the water supply from birth control. What about the PHAs? And the PHAs come from incomplete combustion of fossil fuels, wood, oil, and some of their byproducts are determined to be carcinogenic. The phthalate esters. What are you talking about, phthalate esters? I didn't even know what that is before I started looking at this. And this is used to make some of the plastics more flexible. And it's coatings, as you said, on some things like some equipment.
Yeah.
And these are some of the forever chemicals. They are so stable. That's why they were chosen. And they just don't go away.
Yeah.
And so there's an incorrect presumption that if they're forever chemical, then they're toxic, and then we have to stop using them. And in some cases, that's true. In other cases, that's not. So as soon as you say forever chemicals, it's immediately bad because of the way the press and some of the consumer groups have presented it. Again, love to hear what others' experiences are.
Yeah, Duncan brought up a great one here, because I saw this week too. Can't wait until artificial sweeteners make the rounds. Very prophetic, because I already saw this week there was some stories around stevia, I believe, and artificial sweeteners, and while there may be increased risk. And part of this too, right, is there's a balancing act here, and we've talked about this on the chat before. Is there are consumer advocacy groups out there that make their money and their contributions off of these type of stories. And so they may appear to be neutral parties, but they only get contributions to their particular cause if they scare people, right? So part of their motivation is to go out there and scare people and say, forever chemicals in your food, are your children at risk? Send us $20 and we'll send, or whatever. So They may be right, they may not be right, but there are motives associated with that too. And you need to at least be aware of that and realize these groups may not be the neutral party that you think they are.
Well, I agree with you. And I just want to harken back to a point you made about testing. Some of these products, these emerging chemicals that you brought up, they're actually used in the lab equipment. They're used to test for it. The PAEs that improve the flexibility of plastics. Well, what do you think they're used for? O-rings, seals, plungers, plastic for pipettes, things like that.
Yeah.
And if we really want to scare people, how about this? Engineered nanomaterials.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, these other things, these acronym, these PAEs and these PAHs, these PPCPs, which are the personal care products, perchlorates. Yeah, that's enough. But now we got to worry about engineered nanomaterials into the environment.
Yeah, so they're building these little microtubules, right? These little carbon tubes, and it's like, okay, do these things act like asbestos? Because they don't break down. What are the functions of those? Microplastics in the water, right? We hear this all the time too.
Yep, and microplastics are, I think, another one of the poster children right now, and it's difficult because we know so little about it. Are there detection of microplastics in almost everything? The answer is yes. Is it toxic? We don't know. The public certainly thinks so. The press is certainly represented it as if it had some negative impact on human health. It's not that I want microplastics in my water or my food or things like that, but maybe we just stop eating. Maybe that's the solution. I don't know.
Yeah, that doesn't really work. Oh, and thank you, Claire, for the clarification. I was incorrect. I think stevia was something that they said was okay, but as she said in here, Splenda. So sucralose was the thing they were talking about. Yep, you are correct. Thank you for that. Oh boy. So I mean, part of these that we were talking about too are these emerging contaminants, and wow, these notes as you go through this, right? And so part of what you're looking at with these chemicals that are being created and used in these different applications is kind of how they cycle through things. And they get into the water supply, or they get into the soil, and animals or plants utilize them and they get pulled up into those. And they may be or may not be fat soluble, right? We've seen this with different chemicals in fish, right? And lots of concern around mercury in fish for those type of particular reasons and things like this. Man, it just kind of, it's overwhelming, I think, from a food safety standpoint. And part of this, number one, is I think bringing this kind of back up at a higher level to kind of look around is part of what FDA is looking for here is, are you doing your due diligence and looking at these type of things? And I think one of the things that I see, Alan, I'd be curious to get your take on this too, is documentation of this type of information in your food safety plan. A lot of times just showing the regulatory agencies that you're looking at these things and you understand a potential risk coming down the road is sufficient, because part of this is within your food safety plan, hazards reasonably likely to occur. And that little phrase there is really important in this particular application. Should I be going out and testing for microplastics in the water supply coming into my plant? I don't know. Yes or no. But you need to have documentation relative to that. And as you know, so I've got my share of gray hair here too. And we all remember, if you've been around in this business long enough, the first stab at HACCP went badly because everybody decided that everything was a risk, and the programs became unwieldy, and you would have 30 CCPs in your process and no one could manufacture because you were always in violation. So then they backed off and restarted all those activities.
Well, I think you said something very important. In this kind of reference document that you and I are looking at, we're going to be sharing, you're going to be sharing, there's probably upwards of 30, and these are not extreme. These are currently being discussed and current concerns as far as chemical hazards. But you said something in the preventive controls regulation says known or reasonably foreseeable. Okay. This is tremendously important. If you have not gone back to either the regulation or your PCQI training manual, please look up that definition, because as we didn't want to overwhelm you, but maybe we have, but hopefully we've provided some information of value too. We don't just take everything on this paper, because it's pretty comprehensive, and throw it into the chemical, and say allergens and all these interesting acronyms, most of which start with P's, but not all of them. We have to consider, is it known or reasonably foreseeable? And the idea is the fact that it may be a concern, it may be accumulating in the environment, it may be a forever chemical, does not mean it is known or reasonably foreseeable in your product.
Mm.
And that I'd like to hear some feedback. How do we determine when something is known or reasonably foreseeable? Well, known, we'll test. Well, then we had the discussion about testing and the fact that some of these chemicals actually are probably in the laboratory equipment the lab would use to test for. So that's a challenge.
It's a good point. And part of this too, and that's an important distinction, because so EPA and other regulatory agencies with the government, right? Because now we're kind of getting out of our FDA, USDA bubble, and we're going into other spheres of regulatory control. In that EPA is looking at these things in a different perspective than we sometimes do. So, for example, we've seen issues where EPA has acted really quickly. Think, for example, like as we were talking here with like cosmetic products, where they came up with these little micro granules that they would put in face scrubs and things like this. And they looked at that and said, oh, crap, these things are getting in the environment really, really fast, and they're not going anywhere. Knock them out, right? And so when you look at that, is that when what we look at within food safety, is that a food safety risk? No, it's not. It's an environmental risk in that bigger sphere. So this may be something that EPA is looking at, but to your point, Alan, I think it's a really important one, is should that be considered in your food safety plan? Well, probably not.
Yep. Known or reasonably foreseeable. And I think when we talk about that, let's get back to our comfort level, which is micro for most of us. Known or reasonably foreseeable is fairly well defined. Now, we have had a new entry, Coronabacter sakazaki, which is, and I may be getting this wrong, so I'll make it very quick, but I think FDA is starting to look at this as the indicator of environmental cleanliness. And it doesn't matter whether you are selling to the infant formula industry or not. More and more, I'm hearing from various sources of FDA that, we used to say listeria, or in a dry facility salmonella, or an indicator similar to them. But now they're saying Coronabacter sakazaki may be the best indicator of environmental cleanliness, if you will, in a food facility. So let's take that idea and move into the chemical side. So are there any indicators that we can do, that we can use to determine whether we have some of these very interesting and unique chemicals? And I'd like to hear somebody talk to me more or give me an indication. I don't have the money to test for 20 or 30 of these that are getting a lot of attention right now. So is there an indicator? Is there something similar? I don't have enough chemistry background to know that.
Right. Yeah, definitely with those comments. And Duncan here is really knocking it out of the park with these comments. Thanks, Duncan. Remember how cling fume used to actually cling, and now it's a wrap. That's because they reformulated to take out the additive that caused it to stick to itself. I didn't know that. And yeah, that's true, right? You try and wrap stuff now and it doesn't work too well. It gets back to his earlier comment of, we oftentimes don't learn about these potential risks until after the fact. A chemist comes up with a new and cool application, or hey, if we add this chemical, this fluorinated compound in with these plastics, it makes them flexible. Cool, right? Okay, what else does that do? Right? Nobody's thinking about that until after the fact. So very interesting. And he said here too, kind of what we were talking about. So scaring and, making people, click on the link, right? A lot of times in these type of applications. Big piece of this too is that you mentioned as well earlier, Alan, is regulations are not the same around the world. So what may be allowed here is not allowed somewhere else, and vice versa. And this is once again where your overlap with your food safety plan and these types of things come into play with your foreign supplier verification programs. If they're bringing in chemicals or uses within those companies or those locations overseas where it's okay, you need to be worried about that. So Prop 65, things like this, right? So that's always a headache for companies because it's written in such a way that where you have to declare these potential risks. And so anybody who spent any time in California sees all these signs all over the place of warning, warning, this facility has potential risks, hanging next to the microwave in the breakfast area of the hotel. And you're like, what? And, on that side of things, I'm kind of curious to get people's comments on this too, is desensitizing people doesn't work either, right? Because if you have signs plastered everywhere that say risk, risk, danger, danger, known chemicals, cancer hazard, and it's plastered everywhere, people tune it out.
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind just based on that great perspective of Brian. First is pesticides and herbicides. We aren't spending a lot of time on that. We don't spend a lot of time on that in the US. Why? Because what FDA has said is that as far as a reasonably foreseeable hazard in the US, because of the way that EPA and FDA coordinate, that the pesticides and herbicides of concern are not available. Mm-hmm. And therefore, FDA has said, whether it's been informally or formally, that when you're doing your hazard analysis for chemicals, you do not have to incorporate pesticides or herbicides unless there is something that tells you should. Guess what's one of those factors? If you have a supplier from outside of the US, because that's a whole different regulatory scheme. And therefore, if all my suppliers are US based, my advice, and I consult a lot with companies in the chemical hazards area, pesticides and herbicides are not entered, not because we're ignoring them, but because they are not a really reasonably foreseeable hazard. If you have a supplier from outside the US, now you have a problem or a potential problem. The other thing that's interesting is organic. Now, a lot of it's like organic, or we have the consumers like organic. And so therefore, that means that these products were grown in a manner that the chemicals, the certain chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, and maybe some of these other things that aren't applied. Oh, wait a minute. What about forever chemicals? What about these chemicals that, as you look at the sheet that Brian and I have as reference, they're pervasive. And so I spend a lot more money for organic foods, presuming that they won't have these things, when in fact, some of these are pervasive throughout the US. Many of them in the soil, they're there already. It's not like we'll do this so it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. It's there, and it's probably there at such low levels. There is no real toxicity, but perception is reality, and consumers sometimes have a perception. So what does that mean for the organic food industry? If I were them, they're at a very precarious point because there's no way they can deny that these aren't probably in their foods.
Right, which then gets into other areas of marketing and things like this, because so we lost Alan there. Hopefully he gets back here. And marketing around organic and how that all works. And Duncan had a good comment here. Oh, here we go. Alan's back. There we go. I thought maybe the chemical industry had cut you off there.
Organic.
You've had enough of you, mister. So Duncan had another comment here. It makes you wonder if the microwave is subjecting you to greater risk than the actual food. I doubt it. I actually came across a load of materials from people who microwaved water, and all the plants died. Huh. Weird. Yeah, I mean, all these weird things that we have to kind of think about and worry about. And this is something I saw you had mentioned, these different type of plant-based products and things like this. So of course, within the last decade or so, we've seen this proliferation of alternates for plant-based drinks. And, so soy milk and almond milk and coconut milk and all these type of things. And soy milk in particular Hormones, right? This is one that is around all the time. It's like, oh, there's mimicking hormones in soy that can harm people, and estrogen mimic and things like this. And we used to get these questions in my past life all the time, and they just don't go away. And they're, from my experience on that side, is that there wasn't any link to this, but those type of pervasive rumors out there just never seem to die either, do they?
No. It's interesting. And, one of the challenges is getting back to something you said at the beginning or near the beginning is ADIs and maximum levels. Okay, so let's say that we have enough pressure, we're going to test, and we've done our homework. We've got as much information about this particular chemical or chemicals and there's no way around it. If we're going to keep this customer, we have to test. When we get the results, what does it mean? In many cases in the US, we don't have levels. Now, in a few cases, like for perchlorates and at one or two others, California has. So do we use the California numbers, which tend to be a bit extreme, but it is what it is? What do we use? And so we can use what the customer says, and the customer doesn't necessarily know, or they're grabbing things from news articles where there's no scientific basis. So one of the things that I really like to use as a reference, not as a be-all and end-all, is the Codex General Standard for Contaminants and Toxins in Foods and Feeds. And associated with that, and we can certainly provide a link how to get to it, it has maximum levels. Now, this is not the US level, this is not the European level, this is a recommended international reference document. The other one is the Codex Standard for Food Additives. Now, food additives, are they emerging hazards? Well, let's just say, are they hazards? And the answer is, at the wrong concentration, they are. Are they emerging? I don't know if they fit quite into that category, but maybe we should not exclude them from our discussion. And so if indeed food additives could be a potential hazard, when is too much too much? And again, this Codex General Standard on Food Additives has maximum levels that may be a nice reference. And more so in that document, food additives, the US does have levels, GMP or something else. So, but if there isn't, or you're shipping to a country that doesn't have a standard, these Codex references are quite helpful.
Yeah, and so just doing a quick search, guys, it's pretty easy to find these. So here is, I'll throw in the link here. So a lot of times these go through FAO, right? So here's a good link here for Codex relative to this for food additives. So we aim to serve here on the food safety chat. So there's a good reference for that. And while I'm thinking about it, and I'm doing some links here. Here's the link of where I'll post the research Allen did on this for you, so that you've got that information that we're talking about here as well. So thanks again for that, Allen. That was a lot of work putting this together, and I appreciate that.
Well, and if you wouldn't mind, I've actually added 2 extra pages since you and I talked earlier or last night or late last night or exchanged emails. So if you'd like the additional, I can send that right afterwards if you would like to.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I want it too. I need to look through that as well. So the other area of category, and this kind of overlaps with the FSBP, like we were talking about, is dietary supplements, and these type of novel chemicals and superfoods, as Duncan was talking about earlier, right? These superfoods, whatever. And we saw this with Daily Harvest recently, and this mystery contaminant in this product that they had coming out of Peru, and the work that Bill Marler did around that to try and track down this, what was it, Terra or whatever it was, and this potential link that we talked about with Corey and this professor at Ole Miss saying, which I don't know whether it's accurate or not, is, that some people may be genetically dispositioned toward this particular item. Really? Okay, that's new. So imagine now trying to figure out for your market and your population of your products genetic predispositions to risks. Oh my goodness, how would you even manage that?
Well, this is the problem. The era that we live in today, we probably would not have bread on the market, right? Because a fair number of the population has gluten problems.
Hmm.
Bread and bread products, breading for seafoods and chicken and everything else, um, wouldn't be on the market. But that's
Hmm.
okay because I like plant-based stuff, right? So I'll make breading based on plant-based stuff. And we don't have enough history to know how that impacts us long term. It's probably safe, but is it?
Right.
I don't
Well,
know. I
and
think
part of this
anybody
too
that
is,
says they do.
yeah, if you're utilizing and reformulating things and concentrating plant-based proteins, well, plants come from the soil, right? And they're probably bringing along risks with them. So, do you have higher levels of heavy metal contaminants within those particular processes and those products? Now you're getting into Prop 65 territory. And what are the limits associated with these? One of the problems that we have in the food industry is you're kind of on your own, right? You have to, it's like, okay, if I'm making infant formula, okay, great. I have some understanding around arsenic, but did you know there's inorganic and organic arsenic compounds? One is toxic and one is considered not to be. Okay, how do I measure that? Do I measure it in finished product? Do I measure it in all of my raw materials coming in so I can identify the sources? And if I do that, what's my risk associated with that now? If I have a raw material that FDA may consider adulterated under that standard because you have a contaminant, to your comments earlier, Alan, around alar in apples, you can't dilute a contaminant. So how do you manage that? Oh,
Brian, I'm a marketing salesperson. You just confused me. You said organic and inorganic. What are you talking about? I'm supposed to talk to my customers who are also on the sales and marketing side, and somehow convey to them that our plant or animal base or these new emerging chemicals are not there. One of the things that I found really interesting of the many things you said was this issue of plant-based being so much more healthy. We're not going to go into the environmental impacts, that's for another time. But as far as many of these chemicals that we mentioned throughout our earlier part of the discussion, they accumulate in the soil. The plants do take them up.
mhm.
And therefore, the plants tend to concentrate them. Now, in the animal side, and I'm not trying to bias for animals and against plants or vice versa, but in the animal side, we have filters. Animals that we use products and byproducts from, they have the ability to filter at least some of these chemicals and some of these emerging chemicals out. They take the plants that may have concentrated and they can filter out some things. I'm in the dairy industry. I'm also working in many other industries, but the dairy industry, the mammary gland of animals is a very good tool for filtering out with all the other organs of that animal. And so the likelihood of getting some of those things into that animal byproduct are lower. Has there been studies done to prove that? Not enough. There's a presumption somehow that everything concentrates at the top of the food chain, right? And in some cases, like seafood and mercury, that's very true. In other cases, the animals actually filter out some of those. And so, therefore, there's actually the top of the food chain is safer to consume than some intermediate part of the food chain. We need more research versus speculation.
Right, absolutely, yeah, and so Duncan saying here too, right? Is once you start getting all these variables, right, these things are not additive; they're multiplicative, right? So every level of complexity you add to these things, the more difficult it becomes to manage. So you need to look at, and this is something that we talk about a lot in food safety, is who is your target population? And should you target the highest risk and then just apply that to everything? Well, that becomes very problematic as well. Do you just do the general population? So part of this really, and I would recommend this as the starting point for your food safety plan and your hazard assessment, is understanding that general population of what it is that you're looking at within that. Because I see this is kind of my pet peeve relative to food safety plans, is every one I look at always says when you get to the intended market, it's the general population. And I'm like, really? Is that true? And there have been products that I've looked at in the past where they're making like ice cream novelties or things like this that are clearly targeted to young children. Okay, great. Now you understand, right? But if you're making a generic product, let's just say you're making mozzarella cheese or something like that. When you're looking at all these different variables and permutations on the chemical side of things, what are those levels, right? What's the exposure level? What's all this type of epidemiological information that we need to look at? We like to think that we've got a good handle on the micro side, but clearly, as we're talking about in this conversation around chemicals, this gets really complicated really, really fast.
Brian, I'm so glad you brought that up about the intended user, consumer, and so forth. I find the same thing that you find. And for those companies that want me to help look at or make suggestions to improve their hazard analysis, and you have to have product descriptions first, is frankly, I do not allow those companies to put in their general population. I always put in there, for the population that is not immunocompromised or below the age of 2 or something reasonable like that. Because
Yeah.
I know, particularly in the EU, they are they're using ADIs based on infant and child body weight to set maximum levels, when in fact, as you said, infants and young children don't even eat some of these foods.
Yeah.
I think that is so important. That's one of the good takeaways from the discussion today is go back, look at your hazard analysis, look at your product description, because if indeed you get a consumer lawsuit or a class action suit against, and the trolls in California Prop 60, they're just waiting for something. They find that little thing that says, you said general population. Well, that's not really what I meant. It's in your documents. What did you mean? And then all of a sudden, it introduces questions about the competency of the food safety plan in general, and it cascades. And how you stop that snowball going downhill, I don't know.
Right. And part of this too, from a food safety standpoint, is looking at this and understanding within your company, how do those risks change? So for example, let's say that all of a sudden your sales group decides that they want to target the school lunch program and start selling your products in there, or commissaries in hospitals, or things of this nature. You need to understand that, because now the risk associated with your product has changed and you need to address those appropriately. So part of this is, and I think, kind of bringing this back up as well, is you may not know, you don't know what you don't know, right? And that's a really, really dangerous place to be. Sometimes, just kind of going through the exercise that we're going through here today and getting an understanding of things that may be a potential risk shows due diligence. You don't have to have the answer to everything, but you got to show to FDA or other people at regulatory agencies that you're looking at these things and you're evaluating the risk. And it's not a crime to say, I'm not sure, right? You've heard us say this in this conversation today multiple times. We're looking at these things and there may be a risk associated with this. We're not sure yet. There may be other vectors that this come into play, because part of this to remember as well is we tend to look at these type of processes in the vacuum of our particular product. But when EPA or other agencies are looking at it from an epidemiological standpoint, as you mentioned with Europe just a little bit ago, Alan, is that they are looking at this input on a daily basis for that individual for all the different vectors that are coming in. So you may be a child and you have an exposure level associated with this ADI, as you were talking about. And there's different contributing factors with that, of which your product may be part, it may not. So you need to really step back. So the analogy that we had earlier of, okay, we're in our FDA, USDA bubble associated with regulatory compliance. This expands that radically. And you need to think about it in those terms as well. It's always key to understand the language and the lingo of the organization or reference that you're talking with. So the Codex references for food additives and potential toxins and contaminants and these type of things is completely different, right? And you need to understand that frame of reference.
That's a very good point. And I think as we're getting toward the end of our discussion today, which I've really enjoyed, I didn't know that we would be able to go a full hour, but we probably could go 2 to 3 hours. But I promise not to go beyond this. I do want to bring up maybe one point that we haven't covered, and that is new and emerging. Okay, so
Mm.
what we are talking about today may be the same thing we're going to talk about in 6 months, may not. Now, I like chocolate, okay? So I'm a chocoholic, and many of you do as well. I've got a sweet tooth. And all of a sudden, starting about 2 years ago, there was a discussion about cadmium levels in cocoa powder. Of course, cocoa powder is
Ah.
a source for making chocolate. Who knew? Well, cadmium's a heavy metal, and so what is the issue? Well, we found out that in South America, many of the soils where the small bushes or trees where the cocoa beans are harvested, these volcanic soils have higher levels of heavy metals, certainly cadmium. Now, are they so high that they're toxic? It doesn't appear to be, but they are higher. If you have those same trees or bushes in Africa where the soils are not as volcanic in origin, the levels are lower. So, as a trade issue, this is my opinion, Europeans wanted to drop the cadmium level in the Codex listing of heavy metals for cocoa powder as a way, because they were getting their cocoa from Africa and we were getting it from the Caribbean and Central and America and South America. And all of a sudden, this didn't become a scientific discussion. It became a political, economic, and trade discussion. But that may be a little bit beyond the scope. My point is this: is cadmium 2 years ago in cocoa powder was not an issue. And guess what? During the discussion, California decided to establish a very low level, which is almost impossible to meet. So, and then Europe established the same. And so, even though Codex has a much more moderate approach, because the U.S. and others stepped in and said, let's use science, not let's use other things, which of course were never mentioned publicly. So I guess the takeaway is stay vigilant, because what we're talking about today may not be enough to cover what is a concern for tomorrow: chemical hazards.
Absolutely. Yeah. Here's you triggered me on that as well too, with a chemical we haven't even talked about yet in California and what's going on in Europe. An important chemical in the dairy industry and other industries, titanium dioxide. Right. It's a whitening agent. It's used in toothpaste and dairy and now California and other people are saying, nope, you can't use it anymore. You need to stay ahead of the curve. And I think that's really kind of the overall theme with our chat here today, Alan, is that you can't bury your head. You have to keep up on these issues, and you have to realize what's going on here and bring it to your organization. And if you use, for example, titanium dioxide in your products, you need to go, right? Is the risk real? Is it not? Well, if regulators and state agencies are taking action on this, you need to be ahead of that. You never want to be surprised, right? So there was a plant manager in the past who had said this to me, and it always stuck with me, is Bryan, there's one fatal mistake that you can do if you're a quality manager or something like this, is never, ever surprise me, right? And I think that's a really good way to look at your food safety plan. And kind of bringing this back up to the 30,000 foot summary for everybody is you have to stay ahead of the curve on these things, and you have to be vigilant. We tend to focus on the microbiological. We look at the foreign material piece, which, by the way, is in the top 3 every year for recalls, is we think that we've got the physical side under control. A lot of times we find out that we don't. But I think really the chemical side of things, Alan, is overlooked, and we don't pay enough attention. And I think this conversation today highlights that, because this is complicated, right? This is complicated stuff.
It is, and I don't have much to add to that summary other than I think the best thing we can do is leave. I know you're going to post this so people can review it, because this has not been one of those coffee at the cafe type discussions. This was a pretty deep dive, and that reference paper, which I will update slightly and get to you just within the next hour, I think is something everybody should have. It's a great, it represents hours that most of us don't have to invest, and it's a good quick cheat sheet.
Yep, absolutely. So I think everybody kind of gets a sense here of why I enjoy chatting with Allen and bringing him on here, because he's just a wealth of information. Is there anything out there, Allen, any activities you got going on that you'd like to let people know about?
Um, Really, there are two things. One of the things that I think is not directly pertaining, but it is the 3A sanitary standards for the hygienic design of equipment. Most of us are not in the dairy industry, which it's applicable to. Most of us should still use those standards as guidelines when we're looking at purchasing, or when you are talking to your purchasing people about them. And they have meetings, they're having webinars. If you ever want to know about equipment and what might be acceptable or not acceptable, even if you can't buy equipment that has got 3A stamp on it, I would encourage you to look into that, 3assi.org. And the other thing is the International Dairy Federation, which is the main input into Codex for the international dairy industry, is having a World Dairy Summit in Chicago, October 16th through 19th. Going to be some great information. If you're not in dairy, say, well, I'm not interested in it. I'll tell you, it's going to be covering things like this, including emerging chemicals. Thank you.
Yep. And quick plug for you, Allen. So Allen is one of the foremost experts here in the United States around sanitary design of equipment and the 3A standard and all these activities. And over the years, his contribution in this area has been amazing. So I just wanted to publicly thank you for that.
Appreciate it.
You bet. So everybody, wow, what a chat. And thank you for the amazing contribution. It's why we do this, right? We don't like talking to ourselves, right? We're here to talk with you and share information. And I think the biggest lesson to take out of this is you don't have to know everything, right? You just have to know, as Allen said at the beginning of the conversation, know who to talk to, right? A lot of times, because realizing that you have a gap in knowledge for me is always exciting, because that means that, okay, cool, this is something I need to go and learn more about. And that's what life is about as well, is continually learning and growing. And our food safety plans are the embodiment of that philosophy. So keep going on out there and doing that. And part of that learning process is attending the food safety chat. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we'll see you back here next Friday. So live on YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Live streaming every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Mountain Time, and we'll bring you another expert like Allen, and we'll talk about the next chat. So, Allen, thanks again. Have a great weekend. Always great having you on. Everybody else, have fun out there. Hopefully your weather is enjoyable and you're able to get out and have some fun. So have a great one, and we'll talk to you next week, everybody.
Thank you very much, Brian. Take care.